The morning sun cast long shadows across the military training compound as soldiers gathered for what they thought would be another routine briefing. Among them stood Sarah Chen, a woman whose presence commanded attention despite her modest height of 5 feet 4 inches. Her dark hair was pulled back in a regulation bun, and her uniform bore no visible rank insignia that would immediately identify her position. General Marcus Bradley stood at the podium, his chest puffed with medals and his voice booming across the assembled troops. At 52, Bradley had spent 3 decades climbing the military ladder, but his promotions had come more through political connections than battlefield excellence. His red face and expanding waistline told the story of too many comfortable desk assignments and too few real combat situations. "Today we're discussing advanced tactical operations," Bradley announced, his voice carrying the arrogance of a man who believed his rank made him infallible. "These missions require the highest level of physical and mental capability. They're not suitable for everyone in our modern politically correct military." His eyes swept across the room and landed on Sarah, who stood quietly among the other soldiers. Something about her composed demeanor seemed to irritate him. Maybe it was the way she held herself with quiet confidence, or perhaps it was simply that she represented everything he secretly feared about the changing face of the military. "You there?" Bradley pointed directly at Sarah, his voice taking on a mocking tone. "What's your background, soldier?" Sarah stepped forward slightly, her voice clear and steady. "I have experience in special operations, sir." A snicker escaped from Bradley's lips, and several of his longtime supporters in the room joined in with nervous laughter. "Special operations?" he repeated, his tone dripping with disbelief. "Let me guess. Desk work? Communications? Maybe medical support?" The room grew uncomfortable as Bradley's questioning took on an increasingly hostile edge. Sarah remained perfectly still, her expression neutral, but those who knew her well could see the slight tightening around her eyes. "Sir, I've served in multiple combat deployments," Sarah replied evenly, refusing to take the bait. Bradley's laugh grew louder and more derisive. "Combat deployments? Really?" He turned to address the entire room now, using Sarah as his example. "This is exactly what's wrong with today's military. We hand out participation trophies and call it combat experience. We lower our standards to make everyone feel included." The general began pacing back and forth, warming up to his favorite topic. "Real special operations require strength, endurance, and mental toughness that frankly some people just don't possess. It's not personal, it's just biology. And it's consistent. When lives are on the line, we need our absolute best, not someone who got their position because of diversity quotas." Sarah's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but she maintained her military bearing. Around the room, other soldiers shifted uncomfortably. Some knew better than to challenge Bradley directly, while others were simply unsure of what they were witnessing. "I bet you couldn't even complete a basic obstacle course under pressure," Bradley continued, his voice growing more aggressive. "These elite units you claim to have served with probably had to carry your weight the entire time." The accusation hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Bradley was clearly enjoying himself now, feeding off what he perceived as his audience's attention. In his mind, he was teaching a valuable lesson about maintaining military standards. "Tell you what," Bradley said, his voice taking on a challenging edge, "since you're so confident in your special operations background, why don't we put it to the test? Right here, right now, in front of everyone." Sarah finally spoke, her voice calm but carrying an edge that those with real combat experience would recognize. "What kind of test did you have in mind, sir?" Bradley grinned, thinking he had her cornered. "Simple. Basic hand-to-hand combat demonstration. Show us these elite skills you claim to possess. Unless, of course, you'd prefer to admit that your special operations experience was just pushing papers in a comfortable office somewhere safe." The room fell silent. Bradley had crossed a line that even his supporters recognized as dangerous territory. Military protocol had strict guidelines about such challenges, especially between officers of different ranks. But Bradley was too caught up in his performance to care about regulations. "I should point out, sir," Sarah said quietly, "that what you're proposing isn't standard military procedure. Are you questioning my authority?" Bradley's face was turning red now, his voice rising. "I'm a general in the United States military, and I'm giving you a direct order to demonstrate your claimed capabilities." Sarah looked around the room, taking in the faces of the assembled soldiers. Some looked worried, others curious, and a few appeared to be suppressing smiles as if they knew something Bradley didn't. Furthermore, Bradley continued, building momentum, if you can't handle a simple demonstration with a superior officer, how can we trust you in real combat situations? How do we know you won't freeze up when American lives depend on your abilities? The general was hitting his stride now, using every psychological manipulation tactic he'd learned over his career. Maybe it's time we stopped pretending that everyone is cut out for elite military service. Maybe it's time we acknowledge that some roles require certain physical and mental attributes that can't be taught or faked. Sarah remained silent, but her stillness was different now. It was the kind of calm that experienced fighters recognize in truly dangerous opponents, like the quiet before a storm, or the moment of perfect balance before a predator strikes. "What's the matter?" Bradley taunted. "Suddenly not so confident in those special operation skills? Or maybe you're realizing that your diversity hire position doesn't actually come with real capabilities?" The insult was designed to provoke an emotional response, to make Sarah angry enough to either lash out unprofessionally or back down in humiliation. Bradley had used similar tactics throughout his career to assert dominance over subordinates he perceived as threats to his authority, but Sarah's response was neither anger nor retreat. Instead, she simply nodded once, a gesture so small it might have been missed by anyone not paying close attention. "Very well, sir," she said quietly. "If you insist on this demonstration, I'm prepared to comply with your order." Bradley's grin widened. He was certain he had won already, imagining how quickly this would be over once they began. In his mind, he was already crafting the story he would tell later about putting an overconfident soldier in their place. "Excellent," he said, beginning to remove his jacket. "Let's clear some space and show everyone what real military capability looks like." As the soldiers began moving chairs and creating an open area in the center of the room, none of them noticed the slight smile that briefly crossed Sarah's face. It was the kind of smile that would have sent chills down the spine of anyone who understood its meaning. The stage was set for a confrontation that would become legendary in military circles, though not at all in the way General Bradley expected. He had challenged the wrong person at the wrong time, and he was about to discover just how catastrophic his arrogance could be. The soldiers formed a rough circle around the cleared space, their conversations dropping to whispers as they sensed the gravity of what was about to unfold. Some pulled out their phones, instinctively knowing they were about to witness something extraordinary. Bradley rolled his shoulders and cracked his knuckles, putting on a show of casual confidence. At 6 feet tall and weighing over 200 pounds, he felt certain that size and rank would carry the day. Sarah simply stood quietly, her breathing steady and her stance relaxed. To the untrained eye, she looked almost passive, certainly not like someone preparing for combat. "Last chance to back down gracefully," Bradley announced loudly, making sure everyone could hear. "I'd hate for you to get hurt trying to prove a point about something you're clearly not qualified for." Sarah's only response was to step slightly forward, her movement so fluid and controlled that it seemed almost choreographed. The transformation was subtle but unmistakable to those who knew what to look for. The quiet soldier had become something else entirely. Bradley raised his hands in what he thought was a fighting stance, his form sloppy and his balance poor. Years of desk work had left him soft, though his ego refused to acknowledge this reality. "Whenever you're ready," he called out, bouncing slightly on his feet in what he imagined looked intimidating. Sarah didn't respond with words. Instead, she simply shifted her weight slightly, a movement so small that most of the watching soldiers missed it entirely. But that tiny adjustment changed everything about her presence in the room. The demonstration was about to begin, and General Bradley was about to learn a lesson that would change his life forever. He had challenged a woman whose background he didn't understand, whose capabilities he had grossly underestimated, and whose patience he had finally exhausted. The next few minutes would reveal truths that Bradley was completely unprepared to face, about himself, about the modern military, and about the dangerous assumptions that had guided his entire career. He had wanted to make an example of Sarah Chen, but he was about to become an example himself. The circle of watching soldiers held their breath as the two figures faced each other in the center of the room. On one side stood a general whose confidence was built on rank and bluster. On the other stood a warrior whose true nature was about to be revealed in the most dramatic way possible. General Bradley lunged forward with all the grace of a charging rhinoceros, his telegraphed movements broadcasting his intentions long before his body could follow through. His years behind a desk had left him slow and predictable, though his ego prevented him from recognizing these limitations. Sarah moved like water flowing around a rock. Bradley's clumsy attack met nothing but air, as she simply wasn't where he expected her to be. The movement was so effortless, so perfectly timed, that for a moment the watching soldiers weren't sure what had happened. Bradley stumbled forward, his momentum carrying him past his target, confusion replacing the confidence that had filled his face moments before. He turned awkwardly, his breathing already becoming labored from the brief exertion. "Stand still and fight," he demanded, his voice carrying the first hints of uncertainty. Sarah's response came not in words but in action. She moved again, this time with purpose, that was unmistakably aggressive. Her strike was precise, controlled, and devastatingly effective. Bradley found himself on the ground before his mind could process how he'd gotten there. The general struggled to his feet, his uniform now disheveled, and his face flushed with embarrassment as much as exertion. The watching soldiers exchanged glances, beginning to understand that they were witnessing something far different from what they had expected. "Lucky shot," Bradley muttered, trying to maintain his authority even as doubt crept into his voice. He charged again, this time with more desperation than strategy. What followed was a masterclass in the difference between bluster and skill. Sarah's movements were economical, each one serving multiple purposes. She defended herself while simultaneously demonstrating the vast gap between her capabilities and those of her challenger. Bradley hit the ground again, this time harder. His breathing was ragged now, and his movements had become even more uncoordinated. The reality of his situation was beginning to penetrate his arrogance. "What the hell?" he gasped, struggling once more to regain his footing. It was then that Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, who had been watching from the back of the room, decided that the charade had gone on long enough. His voice cut through the tension like a blade. "General Bradley, sir," Rodriguez called out, his tone respectful but firm. "I think you should know who you're fighting." Bradley paused, his hands on his knees as he fought to catch his breath. "What are you talking about, Sergeant?" Rodriguez stepped forward, his expression serious. "Sir, that's Commander Sarah Chen. She's not just Special Operations. She's Navy SEAL Team 6. The words hit the room like a thunderclap. Conversation stopped mid-sentence, and every eye turned toward Sarah with new understanding. SEAL Team 6 was legendary even within military circles, representing the absolute elite of American Special Operations Forces. Bradley's face went pale beneath the flush of exertion. "That's impossible," he stammered. "Women aren't allowed in SEAL units." "The policy changed, sir," Rodriguez explained quietly. "Commander Chen was the first woman to successfully complete SEAL training. She served multiple deployments in classified operations. Her record is beyond exemplary." The general's world was crumbling around him. Everything he thought he knew about military hierarchy and capability was being rewritten in real time. He had not only challenged a superior operator, but he had done so in the most public and humiliating way possible. Sarah finally spoke, her voice calm but carrying unmistakable authority. "I tried to avoid this situation, General. I gave you multiple opportunities to reconsider your approach." Bradley looked around the room, seeing his career flash before his eyes. The soldiers who had been watching with amusement were now staring at him with expressions ranging from shock to outright disgust. His attempt to assert dominance had backfired spectacularly. "I didn't know," he whispered, though everyone in the room understood that ignorance was not an acceptable excuse for his behavior. "That's exactly the problem," Sarah replied, stepping closer. Her presence now seemed to fill the entire room, commanding respect in a way that Bradley's rank and bluster never could. "You made assumptions based on appearances rather than facts. You let your prejudices override your judgment." The general tried to salvage something from the disaster. "Commander, I apologize. I was simply trying to maintain standards." "No," Sarah interrupted, her voice cutting through his excuses like a knife. "You were demonstrating exactly the kind of thinking that weakens our military. You were more interested in proving your own superiority than in understanding the capabilities of the people under your command." Bradley's supporters in the room had gone silent, distancing themselves from a situation that had become professionally toxic. They understood that being associated with this incident could damage their own careers. Rodriguez stepped forward again, his expression grave. "Sir, there's something else you should know about Commander Chen's record." Bradley looked at him with growing dread, understanding that more revelations were coming. "She's the operator who led the rescue mission that saved your nephew's unit in Afghanistan 2 years ago," Rodriguez continued. "Lieutenant Bradley and his men would have died if not for her tactical leadership and personal courage under fire." The blood drained completely from Bradley's face. His nephew had told him about that mission, about the mysterious SEAL commander who had appeared like a guardian angel and led them through enemy territory to safety. He had never known it was a woman, and certainly never imagined he would meet her under these circumstances. "Tommy's mission?" Bradley whispered, his voice barely audible. "Yes, sir," Rodriguez confirmed. "Your nephew's alive today because Commander Chen risked her life to save him and his squad. She took 3 bullets during that extraction and still managed to get everyone out." The room was dead silent now, the weight of this revelation settling over everyone present. Bradley had not only attacked a superior operator, but he had insulted and humiliated the woman who had saved his own family member's life. Sarah watched the general process this information, her expression remaining neutral despite the emotional impact of the moment. She had recognized the name Bradley when he first introduced himself, but had chosen not to mention the connection to avoid exactly this kind of dramatic revelation. "I need to sit down," Bradley mumbled, looking around desperately for a chair. "No," Sarah said firmly. "You need to stand and face the consequences of your actions. You challenged me in front of these soldiers, questioned my competence and dedication, and made statements that reveal dangerous biases in your thinking." Bradley tried to speak, but Sarah continued. "More importantly, you've demonstrated a fundamental failure of leadership. You attacked someone based on assumptions and prejudices rather than facts and evidence. That kind of thinking gets people killed in combat situations." The general was visibly shaking now, understanding that his career was likely over. Word of this incident would spread throughout the military community within hours, and there would be no way to contain the damage. "What do you want from me?" he asked, his voice breaking. Sarah studied him for a long moment, considering her response. "I want you to understand what just happened here. I want you to recognize that your assumptions about people's capabilities, based on their appearance or demographics, are not only wrong but dangerous." She gestured toward the assembled soldiers. "These men and women are watching you right now, learning from your example. What lesson do you think you've just taught them about leadership, about respect, and about the values of the American military?" Bradley looked around the room, seeing disappointment and disgust in the faces of people who had once respected him. His attempt to demonstrate strength had revealed nothing but weakness and small-mindedness. "I was wrong," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, you were," Sarah agreed. "The question now is what you're going to do about it. Are you going to learn from this experience and become a better leader, or are you going to retreat into denial and blame others for your humiliation?" The challenge in her words was unmistakable. Even in defeat, Bradley was being offered a chance at redemption, though everyone in the room understood how unlikely it was that he would take it. Bradley straightened slightly, trying to recover some semblance of dignity. "Commander Chen, I formally apologize for my behavior today. It was unprofessional and unbecoming of an officer." Sarah nodded acknowledgement but didn't accept the apology as complete. "Apologies are words, General. Actions matter more. The real question is whether you'll change your behavior and thinking going forward." The confrontation had reached its natural conclusion, but everyone in the room understood that the consequences were just beginning. This incident would follow Bradley for the rest of his career, assuming he still had one after the inevitable investigation. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife as General Bradley stood there, his uniform wrinkled and his dignity in tatters. The silence stretched on for what felt like hours, though in reality it was only seconds. Every soldier present understood they had witnessed something that would become military legend, though not in the way Bradley had intended. Commander Sarah Chen stood calmly, showing no signs of the physical exertion that had left the general gasping for breath. Her bearing remained professional, but there was an unmistakable authority in her presence that transcended rank or protocol. She had proven her point without malice, simply by allowing the truth to reveal itself. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez stepped forward, recognizing that someone needed to restore order to the situation. "Sir," he addressed Bradley carefully. "Perhaps it would be best if we concluded today's briefing." Bradley nodded mutely, still struggling to process what had just occurred. His entire worldview had been shattered in the span of a few minutes, and the pieces weren't fitting back together in any coherent way. The woman he had mocked and belittled was not only his superior in every measure that mattered, but she was also the person who had saved his nephew's life. "Before we dismiss," Sarah spoke up, her voice carrying easily across the room, "I think there are some important lessons here that we should discuss." The assembled soldiers turned their attention to her, grateful for someone to take charge of the increasingly uncomfortable situation. Several of them had been recording the confrontation on their phones, understanding instinctively that they were witnessing something historically significant. "What happened here today," Sarah continued, "illustrates a critical problem in military leadership. Too often we make assumptions about people's capabilities based on superficial characteristics rather than actual performance and qualifications." Bradley winced at the words, understanding that they were directed at him even though Sarah maintained a professional tone that didn't single him out personally. "In combat situations, these assumptions can be lethal," Sarah went on. "When we underestimate our allies or overestimate our enemies based on prejudice rather than intelligence, we put lives at risk unnecessarily." Private Johnson, a young soldier who had been watching the proceedings with wide eyes, raised his hand tentatively. "Ma'am, how do we avoid making those kinds of mistakes?" Sarah smiled slightly, appreciating the genuine question. "The answer is simple in concept but difficult in practice. We judge people by their actions, their training, and their results. We challenge our own biases constantly, and we remain open to being wrong about our initial impressions." She gestured toward the group. "Every person in this room has capabilities that might not be immediately apparent. The mechanic might be a brilliant strategist. The communications specialist might be an expert marksman. The supply clerk might have advanced medical training. We discover these things by asking questions and paying attention, not by making assumptions." General Bradley shifted uncomfortably, recognizing that every word was a critique of his earlier behavior. He wanted to defend himself, to explain that his intentions had been good, but he was beginning to understand that intentions mattered far less than impact. Another soldier, Corporal Martinez, spoke up. "Ma'am, how do you deal with people who won't change their minds, even when they're proven wrong?" The question hung in the air, and everyone in the room understood its relevance to the current situation. Sarah considered her response carefully. "That's one of the hardest challenges in leadership," she admitted. "You can't force someone to grow or learn. You can only control your own actions and responses. Sometimes the best you can do is make the consequences of bad behavior clear and consistent." Bradley felt the weight of those words. The consequences for him were indeed becoming clear, and they were far more severe than he had imagined possible when this confrontation began. Rodriguez checked his watch and realized that word of the incident was almost certainly spreading throughout the base already. In the age of social media and instant communication, news traveled fast, and this particular news was too sensational to keep quiet. "Commander," Rodriguez said respectfully, "what should we tell people who ask about what happened here today?" Sarah considered the question, understanding that how this story was told would have implications far beyond this room. "We tell the truth," she said simply. "We explain that a training exercise revealed some important gaps in understanding and communication that need to be addressed." The diplomatic language didn't fool anyone. They all understood that what had really been revealed was a commanding officer's prejudice and incompetence. But Sarah's refusal to gloat or humiliate Bradley further demonstrated the kind of leadership the military needed. Bradley finally found his voice. "Commander Chen," he said, his words coming slowly and carefully, "I need you to know that I'm deeply sorry for what happened here. Not just for the physical confrontation, but for everything that led up to it." Sarah nodded acknowledgement. "I appreciate that, General. The question now is what you plan to do differently going forward." "I don't know if I'll have a chance to do anything differently," Bradley admitted, the reality of his situation finally sinking in completely. "My career is probably over." The honesty in his admission surprised some of the watching soldiers. For the first time since the confrontation began, Bradley seemed to be speaking without pretense or political calculation. "That depends on what you do next," Sarah replied. "Everyone makes mistakes. What separates good leaders from bad ones is how they handle those mistakes and what they learn from them." Private Williams, who had been quiet throughout the proceedings, raised her hand. "Ma'am, what should we do if we see this kind of behavior in our own units?" It was a crucial question that went to the heart of military culture and the responsibility of individual soldiers to maintain standards. "You speak up," Sarah said firmly. "Not necessarily in the moment, especially if it would compromise your safety or position, but you find appropriate channels to address problematic behavior. The military only works when everyone, regardless of rank, is committed to excellence and respect." Bradley listened to her words and realized that multiple people in his own command probably had concerns about his leadership style that they had never felt safe expressing. The thought was deeply troubling. "Commander," he said quietly, "would you be willing to speak with me privately after this? I think there are things I need to understand about my own leadership that I've been blind to." Sarah studied his face, looking for signs of genuine remorse versus political damage control. What she saw was a man who appeared to be genuinely shaken by the reality of his own behavior and its consequences. "Yes," she agreed. "I think that conversation would be valuable." Rodriguez began the process of dismissing the assembled soldiers, understanding that the formal briefing was clearly over, and that people needed time to process what they had witnessed. As the soldiers filed out, many of them stopped to speak briefly with Sarah, offering quiet words of respect and appreciation. Several mentioned that they had friends or family members who had benefited from her service, though none of them had known her identity before today. Bradley watched these interactions with growing understanding of just how respected Sarah was within the military community. He began to comprehend not only the magnitude of his mistake, but also the missed opportunity it represented. Instead of learning from a genuinely exceptional officer, he had chosen to attack her based on his own insecurities and prejudices. When the room had mostly cleared, Sarah approached Bradley, her demeanor shifting slightly from public professionalism to private concern. "General," she said quietly, "I want you to understand that I didn't want this confrontation. I tried multiple times to de-escalate the situation." Bradley nodded miserably. "I know. You handled it with more professionalism and restraint than I deserved. I pushed you into a corner where you had no choice but to defend yourself. The question now," Sarah continued, "is whether you're going to use this as an opportunity for genuine self-reflection and growth, or whether you're going to retreat into resentment and blame." Bradley looked around the empty room, seeing it differently now than he had an hour ago. Then it had been his domain, a place where his authority was unquestioned. Now it felt like the site of his professional and personal destruction. "I honestly don't know," he admitted. "Everything I thought I knew about myself and my career has been turned upside down. I'm not sure what comes next." Sarah's expression softened slightly. "That uncertainty might be the beginning of real growth. When we're forced to question our fundamental assumptions about ourselves and the world, it creates an opportunity to become better people." The conversation that would follow would determine whether Bradley's humiliation became the end of his story or the beginning of a new chapter. For the first time in his career, he was about to engage with someone as an equal rather than trying to assert dominance, and the experience would change him in ways he couldn't yet imagine. 3 months later, General Marcus Bradley stood in front of another group of soldiers, but everything about the scene was different from that fateful day when his world had been turned upside down. His posture was more humble, his voice more measured, and his approach to leadership had undergone a fundamental transformation that surprised everyone who knew him. "Today I want to talk about a mistake I made," Bradley began, his words carrying a weight that captured immediate attention. 3 months ago, I allowed my prejudices and assumptions to cloud my judgment in a way that nearly destroyed my career and taught me the most important lesson of my life." The soldiers in the room listened intently. Word of the confrontation with Commander Chen had spread throughout the military community, becoming a cautionary tale about the dangers of arrogance and prejudice. Most of these soldiers had heard various versions of the story, but few had expected Bradley to address it so directly. "I publicly challenged an officer based on nothing more than my own biases about what a special operations soldier should look like," Bradley continued. "I made assumptions about capabilities based on appearance, and I used my rank to bully someone who turned out to be one of the most decorated and capable operators in the entire military. He paused, allowing the weight of his admission to settle over the room. The old Bradley would have tried to minimize his mistakes or shift blame to others. This new version was taking full responsibility for his actions and their consequences. Commander Sarah Chen taught me something that day that I should have learned decades ago. She showed me that true strength isn't about asserting dominance over others, it's about understanding your own limitations and respecting the capabilities of the people around you. Private Garcia raised his hand tentatively. "Sir, how did you recover from something like that? I mean, everyone knew about it." Bradley smiled ruefully. "The honest answer is that I almost didn't recover. For weeks after that incident, I seriously considered resigning from the military entirely. I felt like my credibility was completely destroyed, and in many ways it was." He walked closer to the group, his demeanor more approachable than any of these soldiers had ever seen from a general officer. "But Commander Chen did something unexpected," Bradley continued. "Instead of filing a complaint or allowing me to destroy myself completely, she offered to help me understand what had gone wrong and how I could do better." The room was silent as Bradley shared details that few people had heard before. "We spent hours talking about leadership, about unconscious bias, and about the difference between authority and respect. She helped me understand that my entire approach to command had been based on fear and insecurity rather than genuine competence." Sergeant Thompson, a veteran with multiple deployments, spoke up. "Sir, what specifically did you change about how you lead?" Bradley nodded appreciatively at the question. "Everything," he said simply. "I started by acknowledging that I didn't know as much as I thought I did. I began asking questions instead of making demands. I started listening to the people under my command instead of just talking at them." He gestured toward the assembled group. "Each of you has experience and knowledge that I don't possess. Instead of pretending that my rank makes me the smartest person in the room, I've learned to tap into that collective expertise." The transformation hadn't been easy or immediate. Bradley had spent weeks in intensive counseling and leadership training, forced to confront decades of ingrained attitudes and behaviors. The process had been humbling and often painful, but it had also been necessary. "Commander Chen became an unofficial mentor to me," Bradley explained. "Even though she outranked me in every way that mattered, she was patient enough to help me become a better officer and a better person." Corporal Davis asked, "Sir, what happened to your career after all this? I mean, did you get in trouble officially?" Bradley's expression grew serious. "There was an investigation, as there should have been. My behavior that day violated several regulations and standards of conduct. I was formally reprimanded and required to complete extensive additional training." He paused, considering how much detail to share. "More importantly, I was assigned to work directly under Commander Chen's supervision for 6 weeks. That experience taught me more about real leadership than 30 years of traditional military education. The assignment had initially felt like a punishment, but it had quickly become the most valuable learning experience of Bradley's career. Sarah had put him through exercises designed to challenge his assumptions and force him to see situations from different perspectives. She made me spend time with every type of soldier you can imagine," Bradley continued. "I worked alongside mechanics, cooks, medics, and communications specialists. I learned about their backgrounds, their capabilities, and their contributions to our mission. The experience had been eye-opening. Bradley discovered that his narrow view of military excellence had caused him to overlook incredible talent and dedication throughout his command. I met a supply clerk who spoke 6 languages and had a doctorate in international relations," Bradley shared. "I worked with a motor pool sergeant who had designed improvements to vehicle armor that saved countless lives. I trained with a communications specialist who had developed new encryption protocols that were being adopted across all branches of the military." Private Martinez raised her hand. "Sir, how do we avoid making the same kinds of mistakes you made?" It was the question Bradley had been hoping someone would ask. "The first step is recognizing that we all have biases and blind spots. They're part of being human. The danger comes when we refuse to acknowledge them, or when we let them override evidence and facts." He began outlining practical strategies that Sarah had taught him. "Question your first impressions. Ask yourself why you believe what you believe about someone. Look for evidence that contradicts your assumptions. Most importantly, give people opportunities to show you who they really are." The conversation continued for nearly an hour, with Bradley sharing specific examples of how his changed approach had improved his unit's performance and morale. The soldiers asked thoughtful questions and shared their own experiences with bias and leadership challenges. As the session wound down, Bradley made an announcement that surprised everyone in the room. Next month, Commander Chen will be conducting advanced leadership training for all officers in this command. I specifically requested her involvement because I believe everyone can benefit from her expertise and perspective. The news was met with obvious enthusiasm. Sarah's reputation had grown even more legendary in the months since the confrontation, and the opportunity to learn from her directly was seen as extremely valuable. I want to close with something Commander Chen told me during one of our conversations, Bradley said. She said that the measure of a leader isn't whether they make mistakes, but whether they have the courage to learn from those mistakes and become better people. He looked around the room, making eye contact with as many soldiers as possible. I made a terrible mistake that day. I let my prejudices and insecurities override my judgment, and I behaved in a way that was unworthy of the uniform I wear. But that mistake also gave me the opportunity to become a better leader and a better person. As the soldiers filed out of the room, many of them stopped to thank Bradley for his honesty and vulnerability. The conversation had been unlike any military briefing they had ever attended, and it had given them a new model for how leaders could handle failure and growth. Later that afternoon, Bradley received a message that Commander Chen would be visiting the base the following week. The prospect of seeing her again still made him nervous, but it was a different kind of nervous now. Instead of fearing judgment or confrontation, he was eager to show her how much he had changed and to continue learning from her example. The transformation that had begun with humiliation and defeat had evolved into genuine growth and improved leadership. Bradley's willingness to acknowledge his mistakes and learn from them had not only saved his career, but had made him more effective than he had ever been before. The story of his confrontation with Sarah Chen had indeed become legendary in military circles, but not as the cautionary tale he had initially feared. Instead, it had become an example of how even the most ingrained attitudes could change when someone was willing to do the difficult work of honest self-examination. Bradley's journey was far from complete. He understood that changing decades of thinking and behavior was a lifelong process, not a one-time event. But he had made a genuine start, and that beginning had already transformed not only his own approach to leadership, but the culture of his entire command. The general who had once used his rank to bully and intimidate had become someone who used his position to lift others up and create opportunities for growth. It was a transformation that few people had thought possible, but Sarah Chen had seen the potential for change and had been willing to invest the time and energy necessary to help him realize it. The lesson was clear to everyone who witnessed Bradley's transformation. No one is beyond redemption if they are willing to face their mistakes honestly and do the hard work of becoming better. It was a message that resonated throughout the military community and beyond, proving that even the most dramatic confrontations could lead to positive change when handled with wisdom and compassion.